Marta had always been an independent woman. At 37, he worked as a chef in a renowned restaurant and led a structured life in a big city. Without children and without a serious relationship, he dedicated himself completely to work and the little time he spent with his younger sister, Helena. However, her routine changed drastically when Helena asked for an unusual favor. Her father-in-law, a 65-year-old man named Augusto, would need a temporary caregiver after knee surgery. As Helena and her husband were traveling for work, they had no one available to take care of him. Reluctant at first, Marta ended up accepting, convinced by her sister that it would only be a few weeks. Augusto lived in a large house, far from the city center, in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. On the first day, Marta realized that living together would not be easy. Augusto was a man with a strong personality, grumpy and averse to the idea of needing help. "I don't need a babysitter, much less someone bossing me around," he grumbled as he saw Marta organize her medicines. "Good, because I'm not here for that either," she replied in her direct way. In the early days, the house was a battlefield. Marta tried to impose her routine, while Augusto resisted any change. However, as the days passed, small interactions began to break the ice. During dinners, they discovered a common taste for classical music and old Italian recipes. One day, while going through a kitchen drawer, Marta found an old notebook with handwritten recipes. Curious, she asked about him. To his surprise, Augusto became enlightened for the first time. "It was my late wife's. She loved to cook." The unexpected connection started there. The days passed, and Marta began to realize that Augusto was not just a grumpy man who was resistant to help. He was lonely. Since his wife's death, his life had been reduced to the monotonous routine of the big, empty house. His relationship with his son, Helena's husband, was distant, and he almost never received visitors. Marta, used to the hustle and bustle of the professional kitchen and the buzz of the restaurant, began to feel the weight of that silence. She made an effort to make coexistence more pleasant, preparing some of the recipes from Augusto's notebook and even playing ambient music during meals. One night, while they were dining on a risotto that she prepared following Augusto's late wife's recipe, he looked at Marta with a different expression. "I haven't had anything like this in years," he said, slowly moving the spoon on the other plate. "Is it the same as what your wife used to do?" Marta asked, curious. Augusto smiled lightly. "No, but it's good." That was the first time that Augusto praised something directly. But not everything was progress. Despite the bond they were creating, Augusto still had moments of resistance. He refused to do the exercises recommended by the physiotherapist, and when Marta insisted, he became even more stubborn. "You don't understand. I've lived enough. Whether I limp or not doesn't make any difference to anyone," he said one day, refusing to get up from his seat. "It makes a difference to me," Marta replied, looking at him. It was the first time the silence between them didn't feel comfortable. Furthermore, Marta began to notice something strange. Some nights, while I was in my room, I would hear noises in the house, squeaking doors, light footsteps down the hallway. At first, he thought it was Augusto walking with difficulty, but when he checked, he was always sleeping. A certain discomfort began to grow within her. Something about that house didn't feel right. Marta's discomfort with the house only increased. Nocturnal noises, previously subtle, became more frequent. One day, while preparing breakfast, he found one of the dining room chairs upside down. Would it be possible that Augusto had walked around the house in the early hours of the morning? Determined to clarify the mystery, the following night, Marta stayed up late, listening to every little sound. Around 2 a.m, he heard a slight creaking sound coming from downstairs. He took his cell phone and left the room cautiously. When he reached the living room, he stopped abruptly. Augusto was there, sitting in the dark, facing the front door. His eyes were fixed, as if he was waiting for something. "Mr. Augusto?" "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to remain calm. He took a while to respond. Then, in a low, hoarse tone, he said, "She used to come through that door, every night." Marta felt a shiver run down her spine. "Who?" Augusto sighed and passed his hand over his face. "My wife. In the first few months after she passed, I felt her presence. I heard footsteps. I could smell her perfume. But over time, it stopped. Until you arrived." Marta's heart accelerated. "What do you mean by that?" He hesitated before continuing. "Since you came, the sounds have returned. Doors creak at night. The chairs are out of place. And sometimes, I think I see a shadow in the hallway." Marta felt butterflies in her stomach. Was Augusto right? Or was it all just your mind playing tricks, mixed with loneliness and old age? That night, she slept, poorly. But something inside her told her she was about to discover more than she imagined. In the following days, Marta became even more attentive to what was happening in the house. He began to write down the times of the noises, the places where he found objects out of place, and even the moments when Augusto seemed most restless. Each night, the feeling that something was wrong only grew. One morning, a louder sound woke her from a light sleep. His heart skipped a beat when he noticed the kitchen light was on. She took a deep breath and left the room, going down the stairs slowly. When he reached the kitchen, he froze. A chair was dragged into the middle of the room. The cabinet under the sink was open, and an old photo was on the table. It was a portrait of Augustus and his wife, taken many years before. Marta looked around, trying to understand how that was possible. Suddenly, he heard footsteps in the hallway. He turned quickly, only to see Augusto standing at the door, his eyes wide. "It was her," he murmured, his voice trembling. "Augusto, are you okay? How did this photo end up here?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I went to sleep and now I'm here." Marta noticed that he seemed disoriented, perhaps even sleepwalking. She took him back to bed, trying to calm him down. But his own mind was buzzing with questions. The next morning, he decided to act. She spoke to Augusto's daughter, Mariana, and suggested that he undergo medical examinations. Mariana agreed and made an appointment. But while they waited for the assessment day, Marta began to investigate a little more about the house and the family's past. It was then that he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Years before, shortly after the death of Augusto's wife, he had suffered a serious episode of mental confusion, claiming that he saw his deceased wife around the house. For a while, he had to be medicated. Marta now found herself faced with a dilemma. Was what was happening in the house the result of Augusto's fragile mind, or was there something beyond what the eyes could see? That night, Marta decided that she needed to see what was happening with her own eyes. To do this, he left a recorder hidden in the living room and kept the bedroom door ajar. The early morning silence was broken by the creaking of a piece of furniture being dragged. Marta held her breath, her heart pounding against her chest. With light steps, he left the room and followed the dark corridor. When he arrived in the living room, he saw Augusto standing by the fireplace, holding his wife's photo again. His gaze was vacant, and his lips moved as if he was muttering something. "Augusto," Marta called softly. He turned around slowly. His eyes were moist. "She's still here," he whispered. Marta felt a shiver run up her spine. "What do you mean?" Augusto pointed to a corner of the room, where an old wall clock kept time with a low tick. Marta looked in that direction, but saw nothing but the shadows cast by the furniture. Suddenly, the clock stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. Then, a whisper echoed through the room. Marta stepped back, her hands shaking. "Who's there?" His voice came out firmer than he felt inside. Augusto closed his eyes, letting a tear fall. I always thought it was my mind playing tricks. But no, she's still here. Marta didn't know if she believed what she saw and heard, but she knew she needed to act. He took the recorder and the next day showed it to Mariana. When they played play, they clearly heard Augusto's faint voice speaking during the night. But then, behind his voice, came another whisper. I never left. Augusto's daughter dropped the recorder on the floor. His wide eyes met Marta's. My God, he murmured. Whatever was going on in that house was deeper than any of them realized. Marta and Mariana spent the morning trying to understand what they had heard on the recording. The whisper sounded feminine, but it was distorted, almost like an echo from the past. Mariana, although skeptical, could not ignore the feeling that something beyond understanding was happening to her father. They decided to call a specialist in paranormal events, an old family acquaintance who had already dealt with strange cases in the city. When he arrived, he went through the rooms of the house with a frequency recorder and a small compass. There is a strong energy here, he said after a few minutes. Not something evil, but definitely a presence. Augusto watched everything from his chair, looking more serene than scared. I knew I wasn't crazy, he murmured. The specialist suggested that they perform a small farewell ritual. According to him, many souls remain trapped by unresolved accounts, and perhaps Augusto's wife was still there because she felt that her husband was unable to move on. That night, Marta, Mariana, and Augusto met in the living room. They lit candles, placed his wife's photo on the table, and, together, remembered the happy moments they had with her. Mariana cried softly, holding her father's hand. The environment seemed lighter. Marta felt a gentle breeze pass through the room, like a whisper of goodbye. Augusto smiled. For the first time since his wife's death, he seemed at peace. That night, he slept peacefully. And in the morning, when Marta checked the recorder once again, all she caught was the sound of the gentle wind passing through the house. She was gone. Months have passed since that night. Augusto's house became a more peaceful place, without strange whispers or sensations of an invisible presence. He, who previously refused to go out, started taking short walks around the garden, and even resumed the habit of reading on the balcony, something he did when his wife was still alive. Marta continued working as a caregiver, but that experience changed her way of seeing what she did. It wasn't just about caring for someone's body, but also their soul and its invisible pains. Mariana started visiting her father more frequently. Before, she ran away from home because the pain of her mother's absence was unbearable, but now she felt like she could move on, as if her mother herself had given her a gentle push to continue. One afternoon, while Marta was watering the plants, in the backyard, she heard Augusto laughing alone on the balcony. As he approached, he saw him looking at the sky. What happened to Augusto? He turned his face away, with a twinkle in his eye. I just remembered something funny she used to say. Marta smiled and nodded, going back to watering the plants. The wind blew lightly, and for an instant, a rose petal gently landed on the empty chair next to Augustus. And then, he finally felt complete.